Picking up with the religious revivals that spread in the upper New York state area, spread down into Ohio, into the frontier, Kentucky, and even over into New England, down into the South. And the larger movement is known as the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. So let me put this up. The Second Great Awakening in this 60-year period, and in the first decade or so, it would have been on a much smaller scale. It didn't catch on like wildfire until the last half of this 60 years. But the Second Great Awakening differed from the First Great Awakening in that you had principles of democracy affecting churches as well as ministers. And so, whereas the First Great Awakening was theologically more Calvinistic, noted by preachers who were Reformed or Calvinistic, that is, they believed in God having chosen who would be saved, the elect. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, Gilbert Tennent, William Tennent. And the First Great Awakening was slightly more emotional and dramatic. The First Great Awakening was slightly more dramatic and emotional than the established religions of the day. And that was one of the criticisms, especially like men like Gilbert Tennent, who criticized the clergy, that is the preachers and priests, saying that many of them themselves weren't even converted. They simply had a cold religion of the head, not one that was warm and fresh from the heart. So the First Great Awakening did have an element of more emotions, more of an emphasis on heart religion versus head religion. But you had people like Jonathan Edwards, who was very cautious about it going way too far to the other extreme. So he investigated. You would have people falling over, barking like dogs, laughing hysterically. And so he was very wary of that, and he studied it, and he wrote a book about how to distinguish true marks of religion versus false marks. The Second Great Awakening was on a broader scale, and you had a much larger emphasis on emotion, and many of the ministers and the traveling evangelists who preached were really concerned that there be outward displays. They felt like this proved that there was true conversion or a true move of the Spirit. So you really did not have a more rational rational mind and rational emphasis to kind of keep it in check, like Jonathan Edwards in the Second Great Awakening. But the Second Great Awakening, as we mentioned briefly Tuesday, was especially on the frontier, in the frontier states, they would have these large tent meetings out in the field, out in the middle of a forest. People would come and set up their own tents and live there for weeks on end. And instead of just one preacher like a George Whitefield preaching out in the fields, you would have several preachers preach during a tent meeting. And they would be white preachers and black preachers and even women preachers. And so that's one area where you can see democratic principles affecting the Second Great Awakening in those that were preaching. Preaching was seen only as a task for men, and women were forbidden to do that. But you had you had women actually preaching during the Second Great Awakening. And this is on page 393 of your textbook, the first African-American woman who was allowed to preach. Her name was Jarena Lee, and she was a free black woman who lived in Philadelphia. And she was a very well-traveled evangelist, revivalist during the 1830s. She would walk up to as many as 12 miles a day to go and preach. And by her own records, in the 30s, she had traveled 2,325 miles and preached 178 sermons. Now, these frontier revivals and tent meetings were catalysts for the rise of the Baptist and Methodist denominations, their rapid growth. And the Methodists were kind of the pioneers in the preachers known as circuit riders, who would travel in a certain route or circuit on horseback and preach and bring revival to those areas. You even had some Baptist ministers do that. But these spiritual these revivals even affected African American communities, and the African Americans, a man by the name of Richard Allen, became a Methodist minister, and eventually he organized a Free Africa Society, and eventually founded a African American denomination called the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME for short, African Methodist Episcopal. And that started in 1793. And one of the reasons was because even in the new rising Methodist and Baptist churches, you still had a separate seating area for blacks in those churches. So they really weren't integrating as far as socially. And so they started their denomination, and by 1846, so a 50-year period, it had 296 churches with over 17,000 members. And this denomination initiated the first civil rights movement. They didn't focus just on religious activities, but also on economic opportunities for people of color, as well as educational opportunities. So the Second Great Awakening, with the camp meetings and traveling preachers, helped to democratize religion in America, because more people than just white males were becoming ministers. During these frontier revivals, women played a huge role in organizing them and being a part of them. So women had more of a role in this revival of religion. And then freed African Americans also preached and were a part of it and had their denomination, this first denomination, formed because of these principles of democracy coming in and affecting the church. Then you'll see here at the bottom of this slide, the slides are up, correct? So you'll see here that the Second Great Awakening and the revivals brought a reform movement, and reform in areas of abolition. A big reform movement was the temperance movement, to greatly decrease the abuse and use of alcohol. And even out of the temperance movement, which called for moderation, you had a more extreme branch of that called the abolition, the abolitionist. Well, no, that's not abolitionist, but well, there was a call for an abolition of alcohol by a more extreme branch of the temperance movement. So we will talk about the reforms towards the end of the class after the break. But these religious revivals were kind of the fountainhead of the reform movements and the rising of Romanticism in America, which we'll get to in a moment. One thing that I wanted to point out to you about these revivals is these movements, several of them started in New York and then spread south and west primarily. One such movement that I want to mention, which would still be in the religious category, would be the rise. Let me just say a quick word about Charles Finney there. He was the most well-known preacher during the Second Great Awakening. And it's been said that he could look at people, and you can see why. He's pretty scary looking. He could just look at people who would maybe be making fun of and sporting his religious emphasis, his preaching, and he could just look at them with a very serious look and bring them to tears. So Charles Finney, the most well-known evangelist, revivalist of the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney really moved from his Calvinistic beginnings to embracing that the gospel is for everyone. And he is the one who came up with, if any of you go to church yourselves, maybe your church has what's called an altar call at the end of the service after the pastor preaches. Maybe it's called the invitation, but it's a time where people are invited to come and pray or make a decision for the Lord, to choose Jesus, to choose God and his way. Whereas the Calvinists don't believe in that, because God chooses who will be saved, and you really don't have a say in it. So Charles Finney was the one who introduced what we would call the altar call. I believe he kind of called it an anxious bench. He would set up like a bench in the front of his meetings, and anyone who felt like the Spirit was dealing with them, they were anxious in their soul, they would come and pray and receive ministry at the anxious bench. So there's a little piece of, oh wow, I just now realized I forgot the American History Joe. I'll do that at the break. But there's a little piece of knowledge that if you go to church, you can share with your pastor, that ask him if he knows that who started the altar call. Put him on the spot. All right, what I wanted to talk about was this movement out of New York by a young man named Joseph Smith. He actually was from Vermont. His family was very religious. And after spending his childhood in Vermont, his family moved to a village in western New York. So he was born and raised in the midst of this religious revivalism. When he was 18 years old, which would be 1823, he's already had one vision you can see when he's 15 years old. In 1823, he was out in the woods of western New York, and an angel named Moroni appeared to him. Led him to a hillside that was close to his dad's farm, where he unearthed these golden tablets. You can see that was a period of 4 years from first seeing Moroni and then being led by him, I'm assuming by subsequent visions. And these gold tablets apparently contained a lost gospel of the Bible, in which it described a group of ancient Israelites who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and had settled in America 2,000 years before Columbus. So Smith, who could barely read at the time, started to translate these tablets, which were supposedly written in Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics. Keep in mind that he was the only one who saw the tablets. And after translating them, he convinced a friend to mortgage his farm, the friend's farm, to help pay for the publication of the first 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. The actual title is The Book of Mormon, an account written by the hand of Mormon upon plates taken from the plates of Nephi, or Nephi. Apparently, the lost tribe of Israel that came over to America were the Nephites. So, having the book published, he began telling people about his experience and started gathering a following of converts. And Smith eventually claimed that his authority came directly from God. He was a prophet, and he formed his Church of Jesus Christ. And later, it was called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The group was a very clannish group. They did not interact much with their neighbors. Joseph Smith criticized and said that all other Christian denominations were false. He denied that there was a hell. He urged his followers to be abstinent concerning liquor, tobacco, and other hot drinks. And he said that the second coming of Christ was very close. But the people in the surrounding area of New York, they didn't trust them. They had secret rituals. They did not abide by local laws. They were very, very clannish. So eventually they moved westward to escape this persecution, looking for a new promised land. Okay, I thought I had, maybe it's the map that is in the book. Yeah, page 396. They went to Ohio, didn't stay very long, about 6 years. Then they went to Independence, Missouri. And then they went to a little town on the Mississippi River in Illinois called Commerce, Illinois. And they renamed the town Nauvoo, which was a transliteration of the Hebrew word for beautiful land. So it was there that they built this first temple in 1836 called the just a Mormon temple, and began to establish their community on strict Mormon principles. There were no saloons or no brothels in the town, and there was about 12,000 people when it was at its highest point. Joseph Smith was the prophet. He kind of functioned as a religious dictator. And later, he announced that he would run for president of America. He had a thirst for power. Eventually, he and his brother were put in jail for opposing a newspaper. Actually, he ordered his people to destroy a newspaper that was opposed to them, and they were put in jail. And in 1844, a mob of people went into the jail and killed the Smith brothers. from there, the Mormons chose a young man named Brigham Young to be their new leader, and he then led them away from Illinois to land that was still a part of Mexico territory near these Great Lakes called the Salt Lakes. Not the Great Lakes, but they were pretty good-sized lakes, and they settled in those plains surrounded by the mountains of now present-day Utah. And so Salt Lake City was founded and is now the headquarters of the Mormons. So another group that kind of grew out of the revivalism, but really diverged from the other denominations that were being added to and growing from the revival. So any questions on the religious revival, the Second Great Awakening, these new groups that we looked at, which go along with the deists, the Unitarians, and the Universalists that we discussed on Tuesday? All righty, we're going to move on to the Romanticism in America. And the Romanticism movement was a cultural shift in America. And it was a shift from scientific rationalism and the Enlightenment towards more of a focus on the arts and literature and free thinking. It did begin in Europe, but you had a group in America called the Transcendentalists who, under the leadership of this man here, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wanted America to be known for their own expression of art and literature that embodied the Romanticism. The Romantics, the scientific rationalists and Enlightenment thinkers who focused on reason really criticized people of faith. Because for rationalists, the human mind, human reason was the pinnacle of learning. And so remember, they did not put any faith, or they did not give any credence or weight to so-called miracles. They did not trust the parts of the Bible that talked about the virgin birth or the resurrection or Jesus raising the dead. They were distrustful of those things. If you could not explain it by reason, then it really needed to be dismissed. Scientific rationalism even took this a step further. As science began to progress, they could observe natural laws in nature like gravity, and they could begin to discover how things worked in nature. And so you had medical advancements, right? Where people discovered germs and people began to discover or produce medicines that could heal sicknesses. And so as that continued to increase, people were saying, we no longer have to believe the old stories that if someone's sick, they've been cursed or an evil spirit is harassing them or possessing them. No, we know that it's germs or something else that can be explained by science, and then mankind can find a way to bring healing. So the transcendentalists, in the broader sense, the romanticists, they said it's okay if people have faith. We cannot know everything about the world simply by scientific observation and rationalism. There are other things that are mysteries out there. And so people of faith are not to be looked down upon. And now the transcendentalists, they were not people of Christian faith. They were people, we might call them mystics. They believed that there was a mystical element to the world. I think I've got some descriptions down here for you. They put stock in people's feelings and intuition more than reason. Reason was not the only thing, and it was not the highest authority. Feelings and intuition. They really believed in individualism over society. Society tends to try to get people to conform, and so they praised individual self-determination, self-reliance, self-culture, self-discipline. They said that everyone has an inner light that illuminates the truth and puts them in direct connection with God, or who they called the oversoul. So they didn't necessarily believe in the biblical God or any other religious deity. They did believe in a higher being, but it was more of like a transcendent oversoul. And this would be different than the deists because they believed in a creator, but he was a very rational creator. Transcendentalists, they wanted to break free from tradition. Their theme song could be that wonderful song that Troy and Gabriella sang in the first High School Musical, "We're Breaking Free," right? That could be the transcendentalist theme song. And then they delighted in nature. For them, the Bible was not the means for special revelation. It was nature. So some summations of those things: truth could not be perceived with the five senses only. Human soul is a part of the oversoul or universal spirit, and it returns there at the person's death. So very mystical, and nature as an object of worship. Now this was not a big movement by all means. It was primarily located in the New England area and many in Boston. But Ralph Waldo Emerson is kind of considered the father of transcendentalism. You've probably heard of Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Longfellow, some of these people. And so let me show a short clip from a great movie that'll take us into our break. If you have not seen Dead Poets Society, I would highly recommend it. It's a great movie. Robin Williams plays a literature professor at a private academy, and he really loves the Romantics. And he has a profound influence on his students. And this little scene here will show you kind of the not just the heart of the movie, but kind of the heart of Romantics, Transcendentalists. Get my volumes turned up here. I'm showing a movie clip, so okay.
Didn't know you were here. I am.
Oh, this is a great scene where he was having them rip out the introduction to their poetry book, and one other professor accidentally walks by and he thinks the kids are becoming anarchists.
So you are. Excuse me. Keep ripping, gentlemen. This is a battle, a war, and the casualties could be your hearts and souls. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Armies of academics going forward, measuring poetry. No, you'll not have that here. No more, Mr. Davis. Now, my class, you will learn to think for yourselves again. You will learn to savor words and language. No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world. See that look at Mr. Pitt's eye? Like 19th century literature has nothing to do with going to business school or medical school, right? Maybe. Mr. Hopkins, you may agree with them, thinking, yes, we should simply study our Mr. Pritchard and learn our rhyme and meter and go quietly about the business of achieving other ambitions. For you. Good luck. Good luck! We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. Poetry, beauty, romance, love. These are what we stay alive for. Whole life of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish. What good amid these, O ye, O life? Answer, you are here. Life exists and identity. The powerful play goes on in you. Powerful play goes on, and you contribute the verse. Who will your verse be?
Alrighty, what will your verse be? Take a break. Let's be back in 5 minutes.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute.
Whoops.
We read and write poetry because we are members of the
Mr. Beams,
Yeah.
Hey, the seniors just got called out for a meeting in the safe room. I think they said
Okay. If you don't make it back, this will be on the course homepage today.
that. Okay, do you want us to just leave this on or just?
Yeah, in case you come back.
I,
Now, in the test, you guys are going to do it at 12:15?
yes, sir.
Okay. All right. We'll see you later. All right, moving on. Oh, I placed my glasses somewhere. Hold on. All right. The Transcendentalists, even though they were a small group, they produced a publication called The Dial. And they, especially the first part of the 1850s, first half, they had produced quite a few works that promoted this ideal that was so well presented in that movie clip, that life is something that we should all strive to live and be a part of and experience. And we are thinking beings. We do have a mind. We also have a spirit, and we want those things to connect with nature. And so it was a very strong, the movement, it was a very strong emphasis on self-determination, individualism, and it was criticized by many. One of the members was Emily Dickinson, a young woman from Massachusetts who stayed single her whole life and basically lived in her bedroom writing poetry. Only 10 of her poems had ever been published by the time of her death in 1886. But she had written 1,800 poems. And she, basically those poems were her way to deal with her questions that she had about life, her doubts. Apparently she fell in love with a minister who was married, so she always felt the pain and despair about that. But she explored themes like death and fear and loneliness, nature, God, things like that. Walt Whitman is probably, and that's who Robin Williams quoted in that movie, Walt Whitman is probably one of the most well-known transcendentalists. In a book that he wrote in 1855 called Leaves of Grass, he introduces the book by saying, "I celebrate myself and I sing myself." So the transcendentalist movement is one that truth transcends our physical senses. We've got to tap into our feelings and intuition. Just observing the seeable world is not enough. Got to learn to use that inner light, which they might say was a divine spark. You know, it connects with this universal soul. So that was a movement, and because they produced books and poetry, it was a movement, a cultural movement, not really a religion per se, but a cultural individualistic movement because your religions are more community oriented. Now, this is an interesting comparison. The Puritans who came to Boston in 1630 being compared with the Transcendentalists. The Puritans, even though people associate the name Puritan with people who are prudes, who only dress in gray and black, they don't enjoy life, or they try to avoid joy and pleasure and happiness. That's just not true. Puritans really believe that God created everything for them to enjoy. So they were very passionate people. And so they believed in the personal nature of religion, just like the Transcendentalists believed in the personal focus of existence. The Puritans, while setting up a communal town and church system, still believed in that each person is responsible to God. And so if you were born into a family in which your parents were both, we would say, saved or believers, that doesn't make you an automatic believer. You must yourself come to believe. And so the desirability of self-reliance. But I mentioned this earlier, Transcendentalists differed from Puritans in that they looked to nature, not the Bible, as the primary source of divine revelation. And that all human beings could connect to a divine source, not just the elect. So that's really interesting that this movement sprout up and grew, although not as big, along with the revivalistic Second Great Awakening movement. Any questions before we move to reform, the reform movements? So there were several reform movements that were kind of the Second Great Awakening was a strong religious revival in which people were individually converted. And then I believe during Charles Finney's time of preaching, 100,000 people had converted to Christianity. So, in several towns, you'd have large groups of these new converts in areas, especially in New York, large groups of new converts. And so, along with their new religious excitement, there was a reform impulse that sprang out. Their belief was that these individual conversions should lead to having a great effect on society and culture and lead to the improvement of culture. This is an incident where you see the new belief that human beings, this came from Unitarians and Universalists and Deists, that human beings were basically good and not depraved, and human beings were capable of improving things. So this kind of merged with the religious awakening into these reform movements. And there were movements, as we mentioned, to bring temperance in the use of alcohol, abolitionism. Movements really gained steam to abolish slavery. Education. There was a reform for education, especially public education. At the time, you had private schools being the majority of the schools, and they were not sponsored by the government. You had to pay to have your children go to these schools. So many people wanted public schools. Public schools would reduce crime, and it would help with jobs because jobs required schooling. And so you had a strong reform movement for education, public education. And the schools would be funded by government, by taxes. This kind of sprouted up in 1830 in the Philadelphia area. There was a group called the Working Men's Party of Philadelphia who called for a system of education that shall embrace equally all the children of the state, of every rank and condition. A key political leader in the creation and growth of public education was a legislator from Massachusetts named Horace Mann. And he pushed for public schools in which there was age separation and a common curriculum. And it would be a tax-supported system that was open to everyone, regardless of their class, race, ethnicity, and that also included immigrant children. Horace Mann also sponsored the creation of the State Board of Education, and then when it was formed, he served as its leader. So, a educational reform movement. You even had it in you saw down here, there was a women's rights reform movement. You had kind of a cross section of the women's rights movement with the education movement as more academic schools for women were formed, including female seminaries. And I'm a member of the Oklahoma Historical Society, and I get their academic journal. And there has been quite a few articles about women's seminaries that were started here in Oklahoma. Trying to remember which school was started primarily for that, and now it's a public university today. I'll try to look that up and have that for Tuesday. But and then even African American girls are starting to get more opportunities to get education. There was also a reform movement to improve asylums and penitentiaries. So these people who had been converted, and not all of them, not all of the people involved in these things were just Christian converts, but there was a strong impulse after experiencing conversion to go out and make things better in their world. Drinking was very common in America in the early 19th century. Matter of fact, there was a lot of alcohol consumed at that time. And so you had a group in 1826 called the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, which was basically a group of Boston ministers who they sponsored lectures and saw to the formation of local chapters, societies, and their goal was to get people on board with this movement. They would ask people to sign a pledge to stop drinking completely and to put the letter T by their name, which stood for total abstinence. Out of this practice came a new word in the English language called teetotaler. So if you have a great aunt, or if you had a grandma or a grandpa who said they were a teetotaler, that means they refrain from any use of alcohol. So eventually there's going to be a strong movement to a strong alcohol abolition movement. You'll even have a party, a political party, rise up that they want to abolish drinking. We even have an amendment passed that's later rescinded in the Bill of Rights that was outlawing liquor. So but all that started with this reform movement in the first half of the 19th century. The movement for the asylums and penitentiaries was to the focus for prisoners was not just punishment, but to rehabilitate them. Rehabilitate them, and hopefully they can go back into society and be productive citizens. Those in asylums, the idea was those who were maybe orphans, disabled in society, if there were places set up for them to go, they could separate themselves from society for a little bit and they could become whole again. And then it even was, it moved into the area of helping those that were considered legally insane, the mentally ill. There was a reform that there would be much better treatment for these people than what was being done for them at the time. One woman even did a 2-year investigation, and she revealed after 2 years that these people who were mentally ill were confined in cages and closets and cellars. They were chained. They were beaten with rods. They were lashed into obedience. So we're going to stop there, and we will very quickly Tuesday deal with the women's rights reform and then the anti-slavery reforms, and then get into chapter 13. I'll have these slides up along with some others from Tuesday's material up today. Any questions? What was the name of the evangelist who started altar calls? Charles
Finney.
Finney, yeah. Quiz your pastor about that. He'll love it. All right, have a great day, and we'll have a great weekend. We'll see you on Tuesday.
You as well.
Thank you.